what I would like to do is draw in the sine or cosine graph. Okay, so if you have an asymptote, then the sine or cosine graph had to have been what? Yeah, so this starts at 0. We know the high and low points stay. This one would be back to 0. This point would have stayed. And back to 0. Okay. So if I draw that, does that look like a sine or a cosine? That's a sine graph, so that means this would be a cosecant graph. But it normally starts over at 0, so my whole graph got shifted left pi over 2. So that means in my problem it had to have been x. Which one moves it left, plus or minus? Remember, inside does the opposite of what you think. So x plus pi over 2. So number 4 is actually graph A. All right, so let's keep trying to narrow this down. If I look at this one, this is an asymptote, so it had to have been 0. Then it went down, back to 0, up, back to 0. So is that like a sine or a cosine graph? That's a sine. 0 to 2 pi is what sine normally does. So we're looking at cosecant. We have the normal interval, so it's an x. But sine normally goes up first, and this one went down first. So that means it's a negative. So number 1 is graph B. Is this making sense so far? Okay, C is kind of the tricky one. So this point would stay. This would have been 0, 0, and 1. So if I'm looking at that, is that a sine or a cosine graph? Cosine. So that means I'm looking at a secant graph. Okay. Here's the deal. There's actually a couple different functions that we could write for this. But keep in mind, this pattern would continue, right? So they gave us this snippet, but we know it would come back down and go back down like this. If you just looked at this portion, doesn't that look like kind of like the normal cosine graph? Except what's wrong with it? It's flipped. So we could have done a left or right, but if we look, we really don't have to. This is like our normal secant graph, just flipped. So this is a negative secant of x. So number 2 is graph C. Okay, the last one. So this would be a 0, A1, 0, 1, 0. So this looks like a sine graph. So it looks, we would think cosecant, and we could get a cosecant function for this. But our only option left is secant. Okay, if you think about this, that minus pi over 2 would move it to the right, pi over 2. So if I shifted this back, pi over 2, then it would have started up here, and then wouldn't it look like a normal secant graph? So 3 is actually graph D. So a little bit tricky here because in general, with writing the equations for these graphs, there's more than one correct answer, but that's why I wanted you to talk about those together. I would like for you guys to take a minute now. I want you to look on page 166, and I want you to try 1 through 6, the matching thing. So take a minute, look at those, and then we'll talk about those together. Think about your normal graphs. Tangent goes from where to where?
Negative 100 to
these are asymptotes, 0 in the middle. Does it increase or decrease? Increase. So this is our normal tangent graph. Then cotangent. What interval do we pick for cotangent? 0 to pi. Okay. Again, you hit 0 in the middle. Asymptotes at the end. Does it increase or decrease? Okay. So negative tangent. It should still go from negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2, but we flip it, so it should be decreasing. So which one is that? C. All right, negative cotangent should still go from 0 to pi, but it should be flipped. So that would be A. All right, tangent of x minus pi over 4. What does that minus pi over 4 do? Right, moves it to the right. If you need to, you could set up the interval, you know, if you got confused. So you would add your pi over 4, so you're going to be at negative pi over 4 to 3 pi over 4. So it should have this shape, should start at negative pi over 4 and end at 3 pi over 4. So which one is that? B. Okay, so this would move my cotangent graph, pi over 4, to the right. So it will now, if you set up your interval, you'll get pi over 4 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 5 pi over 4. So it should look like this one, but just moved right pi over 4. So which one is that? D. All right, cotangent of x plus pi over 4. So it's cotangent. Adding pi over 4 would move it left pi over 4. So it will now start at negative pi over 4. So that would be F. And this would take my regular tangent graph and move it left pi over 4. So we'll start at negative 3 pi over 4. So that is E. Is it getting easier as we do more of these? The secant and cosecant are really kind of hard because there's multiple equations that you can do with them. But hopefully this helped a little bit. So now you have time to work on those 2 assignments.